Paul had been hiking solo through the dense forest trails for years. It was his way to unwind and disconnect from the busy world. The woods were familiar, peaceful, and he always followed the same path. But one late autumn afternoon, he ventured a little further than usual. That's when things began to feel wrong. Paul loved the woods. To him, it was the one place where everything made sense. No phone calls, no deadlines, just nature. He had a routine. Every Saturday, rain or shine, he'd hike the same 3-mile loop through the woods near his home. Over the years, he'd gotten to know the trail like the back of his hand. Every twist and turn, every slight incline, even the fallen logs that had become permanent markers along the way. But that late autumn day felt different from the moment he stepped out of his car. The sky was overcast, casting a grayish hue over the forest, and a chill lingered in the air. The trees, now bare of leaves, looked skeletal against the darkening sky. Paul zipped up his jacket and headed down the trail. At first, everything seemed normal. His boots crunched through the dry leaves, and the familiar scent of earth and pine filled the air. He welcomed the quiet. No buzzing phones, no cars in the distance, just the stillness of the woods. But as he got deeper into the trail, he noticed something strange. The woods were unusually quiet. Not just peaceful, but dead silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant gurgle of the stream that usually accompanied his hikes. It was as if the entire forest had gone into hiding. Paul shrugged it off. He'd read about animals sensing shifts in weather or predators, causing them to fall silent, but that uneasy feeling gnawed at the back of his mind. He kept walking, trying to push the discomfort away. A few miles in, he decided to take a side trail he had passed dozens of times, but never explored. It wasn't marked on any map, just a narrow path leading deeper into the trees. He figured it might add another mile or two to his hike, but the adventure intrigued him. As he made his way down the unfamiliar trail, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air felt colder, denser, and the trees seemed to close in around him, making the trail feel narrower. The deeper he went, the more he felt like he was being watched. It wasn't the typical paranoia that sometimes crept in when you were alone in the woods. This felt different, intense, like eyes were on him, unseen but undeniably present. Paul stopped, listening intently. His breath was the only sound he could hear. He turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the stillness of the woods. He shook his head, laughing at himself. "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath. It was just his imagination playing tricks on him. He continued walking, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. The trail began to narrow even more, the trees pressing in on either side. He could feel his heart starting to race, though he couldn't explain why. Then, he heard it, a faint crunch of leaves behind him. Paul froze. He listened, heart thudding in his chest. The sound came again, this time closer. He turned around quickly, expecting to see a deer or some other animal. But the trail behind him was empty. Just the same trees, standing silent and still. His skin prickled. It wasn't an animal. The steps had been too deliberate, too human. Paul tried to shrug it off again, but the unease was growing. He quickened his pace, suddenly eager to get back to the main trail. His footsteps seemed louder now, echoing through the stillness. And then, it happened again. The crunch of leaves, but this time, it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was behind him. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. He could see no one. But the sound was there. Steady, deliberate footsteps following him, matching his pace. He broke into a jog, trying to put distance between himself and whatever was out there. But no matter how fast he went, the footsteps followed, always just out of sight. Panic started to set in. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something about this felt wrong. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't another hiker. The sound was too close, too precise. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. Paul's lungs burned and his legs ached as he ran, the cold air cutting into his throat. Every so often he'd glance back, but there was nothing, just the empty trail, mocking him. The footsteps, though, never stopped. They were always there, just behind him, taunting him. As he rounded a bend in the trail, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing. His car was parked just beyond the clearing, a welcome sight in the growing darkness. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. He slowed to a walk, catching his breath as he reached the edge of the clearing. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. Movement between the trees. At first, it looked like a shadow, shifting unnaturally. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong with the way it moved, jerky and disjointed, like it didn't quite belong. Paul's breath caught in his throat. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, just far enough away that he couldn't make out its features. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs seemed too long, its posture hunched. It didn't move, just stood there watching him. For a long moment, Paul and the figure stared at each other. Then, slowly, it took a step forward. That was all Paul needed to see. He turned and sprinted toward his car, not daring to look back. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door and threw himself inside. As he slammed the door shut, he finally looked back at the clearing. The figure was gone. The trail was empty, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Paul sat in his car for a long time, trying to calm his racing heart. He had no explanation for what had happened, but he knew one thing for certain. Something had been out there. Something had followed him. He started the car and drove away, the trees looming in his rearview mirror, casting long shadows across the road. That night, Paul lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of the figure from his mind. He had always felt at home in the woods, but now, the thought of returning filled him with dread. He never went back to that trail. Some places he realized were not meant to be explored. Jess and her boyfriend Mike loved camping in remote areas far from crowded campgrounds. They'd spent years seeking out isolated spots in national forests where they could enjoy nature uninterrupted. One weekend, they found the perfect place, an isolated clearing deep in the woods, miles from the nearest trail. It was quiet and peaceful, just what they wanted. But as night fell, they realized that the woods were far from silent. The day had been perfect. Jess and Mike had driven hours to reach this secluded spot deep in the national forest. After parking the car at the end of a narrow dirt road, they hiked several miles through dense trees until they reached a small clearing. It was ideal, completely isolated, no signs of other campers, and not a sound other than the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. After setting up their tent and building a fire, they relaxed, enjoying the peace and quiet. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow through the trees, and the temperature had dropped just enough for the fire to feel warm and comforting. "Not bad, right?" Mike said, stretching out on a log beside the fire. Jess smiled. "It's perfect. I can't believe we have this whole place to ourselves." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire crackle and pop. The sky darkened, and stars began to twinkle overhead. Jess leaned back, staring up at the vast, starry sky. She loved this, being away from the city, away from people, just the two of them in the middle of nowhere. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started as a faint sound in the distance, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. At first, Jess thought it was an animal, a coyote or maybe a bird. But as the sound grew louder, her stomach twisted. It wasn't an animal. It was a scream, a high-pitched, gut-wrenching scream that echoed through the trees, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Jess and Mike froze, staring at each other in disbelief. "Did you hear that?" Jess whispered, her voice tight. Mike nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah, I heard it." They sat in silence, straining to listen. The scream had come from deep in the woods, far enough away that it was hard to pinpoint the direction. But it was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, was screaming. And it wasn't the kind of scream you could ignore. It was a scream of pure terror. Jess's heart raced. She stood up, glancing around the clearing. "What do you think it was?" Mike shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe someone's hurt." But even as he said it, Jess could tell he didn't believe it. They were miles from the nearest trail, and they hadn't seen another person all day. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, screaming? They waited, listening for any other sounds, but the forest had gone eerily silent. No animals, no wind, just the quiet crackle of their fire and the pounding of Jess's heart in her ears. "Maybe we should go check it out," Mike said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It could be someone in trouble." Jess didn't like the idea. In the dark? What if it's not? She trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. What if it wasn't someone in trouble? What if it was something worse? Another scream pierced the silence, this time louder, closer. Jess grabbed Mike's arm, her pulse racing. "We should leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this." Mike hesitated, looking out into the dark woods. The firelight only reached so far. Beyond that was pitch black. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, okay, let's pack up." They hurried to gather their things, their movements frantic. The fire, which had felt comforting moments ago, now seemed to cast eerie, flickering shadows around the clearing. Every noise, every snap of a twig made Jess jump. Her hand shook as she stuffed sleeping bags and food into her pack. Another scream echoed through the trees, followed by a faint rustling sound, something moving in the woods. Jess froze, her breath catching in her throat. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. "Mike!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you hear that?" Mike stopped what he was doing, straining to listen. The footsteps were unmistakable now, crunching through the leaves, moving steadily toward them. Jess's chest tightened with fear. Whoever or whatever was out there was getting closer. Mike grabbed the flashlight, pointing it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and underbrush. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming toward them, moving through the forest, just out of sight. "Let's go," Jess urged, panic rising in her chest. They threw the rest of their gear into their packs and hurried toward the trail. Jess's heart pounded in her ears as they moved quickly, the sound of footsteps still following them, getting closer with each step. They were halfway to the car when the scream came again, this time from right behind them. Jess spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping through the trees. Nothing. The forest was empty, but the scream had been so close. Too close. They broke into a run, fear driving them forward. Jess didn't dare look back again. Her only focus was on reaching the car. The sound of footsteps and rustling leaves seemed to follow them all the way. When they finally reached the car, Jess's hand shook so badly she could barely get the keys out of her pocket. They threw their packs into the back seat and jumped inside, slamming the doors behind them. Mike started the engine, his face pale and tense. As they drove away, the headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, but Jess couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, following them, just out of sight. They didn't stop until they were miles away, back in town, the safety of streetlights and other people surrounding them. But the memory of the screams stayed with Jess, haunting her long after they'd left the woods. The next morning, they reported the incident to the local ranger station, but the ranger's response was far from comforting. "We get reports like that every once in a while," he said, his tone casual. "People hear screams in the woods, but when we go out to investigate, there's never anything there. Just the forest. It can play tricks on you, you know?" Jess didn't believe it. The screams hadn't been a trick. Someone had been out there, and they weren't the only ones who had heard it. Thanks for watching the video. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you loved the twists and turns, don't forget to hit the like button and share the stories with your friends. Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling tale. because there's always a new mystery or adventure just around the corner. Until next time, keep imagining, keep exploring, and remember, nothing is ever quite what it seems.